Brian.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm okay. Dealing with some technical issues today, so a little frustrated.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's been there,
How are
and
you?
I'm rowing the boat, and we're looking for things warming up here. I've actually was digging a drain line, yeah, all yesterday, so the weather's
Gray
nice enough.
water?
Yep, and
Nice.
so a little more shoveling than I've done in the past recent months. So you know,
I hear it does build character. I'm not sure if there's an expiration date on that.
everything starts. It seems like with a hole. And whether you're planning something or building something, or it just you always have to start from the ground up, as they say.
Yep.
And
Yep.
it's funny because there's always been this derogatory association with ditch diggers, right? And oh, you're just going to be a ditch digger. And I worked running a public water system, so not only did I do a lot of ditch digging personally, but I also worked with people that they worked for me, just on a sporadic when we needed them kind of a basis. And they were kind of at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder in the category of people willing to take work digging ditches, which, what I would like to point out is that it takes character, a certain type of character to dig a ditch well. Like I've had people that I had to actually let go from the position because there are certain things, for example, there's a whole branch of what we call excavation law, because people get killed in ditches that were dug and not done correctly. And there's physics behind it, and there's understanding the soil, and there's then when you're digging a ditch to look for something that you don't know where it is, there's actually reading the soil, the compaction of the soil, to know whether you're digging in new undug dirt or whether you're on the trail of someone that's buried something. You're looking for a power line or a usually a water line, but often there's other things in there. I was in an old town, so there were two other water systems in old iron that I was finding all the time, just random directions and things. So it was kind of an
Mhm.
educational thing. And so it turns out that even in ditch digging, there are good ditch diggers. There are not that good ditch diggers. And there are things that are learned. This is another phronesis, right? This is another thing that you don't learn how to read the side of the trench until you've done this a bunch and you've maybe spent a lot of man hours, not easy man hours, um, doing that. And now let's talk about it in February.
Well, that's a different beast. Yeah.
And
Go to the
this is
ground.
this is character building, and
Yeah.
honestly,
Or on the mesa, once you get a foot or two down, and then you're just dealing with rock. It's sometimes impossible rock, even.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
But these are what we're into the territory of what we've borrowed from Robert Persig and Zen of the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance as the territory of gumption.
Hmm.
And digging is not easy. Digging on top of a water leak where you're dealing with really heavy, gross clay that's now really heavy at the end of a shovel. Uh, then there's doing it in 28 degrees. And I've literally been in a hole and had someone drive by in their car, one of these snappy cars with has the thermometer inside. And she rolled the window down like a crack and said, "My car says it's 28 degrees." Now, a little secret that what us ditch diggers know is that it's warmer down in the hole than it is out on the surface as soon as you get past a certain coldness. Unless you're in the really cold where the water's freezing immediately. But if the water that's coming into your hole is staying water, you may be warmer down with the water in the hole than up on the surface. But on the topic of gumption, it was those kind of repairs that you have to do it, right? Like it doesn't matter what the time or like you have to deal with this because your tank is draining. Your town lives off this tank, right? So so you don't have any side angles You must deal with this. And it might be any time, day or night, and it might be in a snowstorm, or it might be in 28 degrees, and now you need someone to help you dig that ditch. Do you think that people of no character will be there to help you in a situation like that? No, no, that's not true. That's not true. It takes some chops, some cojones, as we say in New Mexico. You got to cowboy up, right? And so, what I learned from that, which I've mentioned, I think, before in a previous episode, is I would get a call and I would enter an immediate state of anxiety because I know I might, you're just going to, maybe you're just in for a bunch of punishment now. And I would go into that chatter in my head about, oh, this is really going to suck. I was asleep in bed, or I was, just having my normal happy, what's my day going to be? Now I'm in a muddy hole in these circumstances. I don't know what. I've got people pressuring behind. They want to see this thing fixed. You know, and I've been literally in a hole and had people call me to say, I couldn't take my shower this morning. It's like, are you kidding me? I'm on all fours in a mud-filled hole, right? And you're calling me to complain as you don't have, and you think you're going to get your shower faster by calling me and making me have to talk to you on the phone instead of doing the thing that I'm in the hole. It's like, come on. And so anyway, I developed character in a number of dimensions, I think, from that experience. And what I learned to say to myself was, okay, maybe this looks bad, but you don't know, right? Just a possibilistic universe. Maybe there's a probabilistic thing here, but you don't know, and you're not suffering now. So, don't suffer until you're actually suffering. And that's that um the mind sort of amplifying things, and it's like, what wasted emotional energy if you get there and you find out that, maybe for one reason or another, it does occasionally happen that the leak is on the customer's side, and there's a valve and you can just turn it off and go back to bed. uh, or sometimes it was water that was let out because a washing machine broke, and so a bunch of water went down the road, or so then I would feel like such a fool because here I experienced all of this future suffering that then in the reality there was no suffering behind it at all. I had just pre-suffered. It's like,
That's like a
so
legal
it's
term.
oh, I bet, yeah. And but so it is so it, but it shows up legal also because it's a thing in the mind, right? It's so so yeah, this is just part of our interaction with reality, and not being led astray, to get into that condition of just being present to it and pushing through it, you know.
I trust it wasn't lost on our listeners that to Brian, the snappy new car is the one with the thermometer that tells you the temperature. That's like the hot new feature.
Right, right. That and starting.
Newfangled. Yeah.
For example, my current van, which is my new van, which is really cool to me. It's 20 years old, but it's still under 200,000 miles. And but there's a neutral safety switch. I'm from the old school that wants a clutch and the four gears, because when I'm stuck in the mud, I want to be able to go reverse first to be able to rock to get out. And a, a standard automatic, or a typical automatic, let's say, won't let you do that. You'll lose all momentum going between the one and the other, and that's exactly the point, is momentum, right? So, but this, of course, has to have a neutral safety switch so that when the car starts, it knows that it's in neutral, and the starter isn't going to race it across the parking lot because some Jamocha left it in drive. So it's got this switch. And of course, it's a mechanical switch. So it's connected by a cable to the thingamajig on the tree, right, by the steering wheel. So that cable, of course, is 20 years old. So now it's stretched. So for a while, it was intermittently not telling the transmission that or the transmission wasn't telling the brains of the car that it's okay. We're chill. So I basically have just put a wire so that I
Oh,
can
sandwich.
directly connect my solenoid to tell the starter to start, and if I have the key, so, it makes the van harder to steal if you don't know that, but it does mean that every time, and I will ultimately maybe wire a switch in, because I can just put a switch on the dashboard that does the same thing, but now I'm touching a wire to the positive on the battery everywhere to start the van. But this van is still so much better than what I was dealing with before. So, you know, it's what you're used to. It's all what
Nice.
you're used to.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember I told one of my customers once, a great customer, great guy. If he's listening, he'll know that we're talking about him. I went to see him in Florida, and I showed up at the restaurant where we were meeting, and he asked me how I was doing, and I said I was really excited. I just bought a new car, and he asked, "What did you get?" And he had just bought a new 3/4 ton truck, like literally new, and I had bought a 10-year-old Subaru that only had I think 80,000 miles on it, and that was like the newest car I'd ever bought.
Barely broke in
Barely, yeah. Um, so so,
on the
he
old Subarus, that
he
is.
always teases me about that. It was the last year that they made the small body Outback, and it was a standard, so it was peppy, um,
Yep.
good in the snow, and Isaac's driving it now.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, no. We did the Subaru thing for quite a few years. Andy still has one.
Yeah.
No, this is not a sponsorship.
No, not yet.
No, no. We could go. I could tell you the other side. Yeah. but but yeah, so there's definitely something to making like, this is again coming to terms with your ass for it bears you in
Yeah,
another form.
yeah.
But
So, you had suggested, when we talked before all the technical problems, that you might have a topic for today.
yeah, yeah. Well, unfortunately, today's topic starts off on a sad note. Those of you that are watching through YouTube or Rumble, you can see that I'm not wearing my usual black hat. And some people on TikTok have commented about the hat. They want to know where they could get one, well, I have sad news, and the sad news is that the hat. You might be able to see my finger coming through it. My hat got found by the dogs, and they really enjoyed it, I'm sure. But so we'll see whether it will live again or not. It became somewhat disfigured anyway. So it got me thinking about the general topic of hats. And I have said for a long time, you might have heard this years ago when I've said it's all about the hats. And I'm referencing pretty much all of human history when I say the it. It's all about the hats, right? And sounds silly, but when we get into it, there's a little more going on there than you might think. So
Yeah, hats are a big deal. So what are we going in the direction of the Vatican or the cowboy or the kippah or yarmulke? Where are we going?
I like the big headdresses with feathers too. Let's
Yep.
not leave that out, right? Well, let's start with why was this hat not on my head where it's harder to get? It was on the table because it got hot, the seasons changed. I was wearing my wide brimmed, this is more of my Indiana Jones hat. And it's got a nice big wide brim. But before that, when it was already sunny, but it wasn't quite as hot. I was wearing this hat. YouTubers will understand. I'm just sort of switching from one kind of a cowboy hat to another. This is a wool hat, I believe. The old style ones were maybe beaver. And now you might look at that hat and you might say, my God, that thing is gross looking. And I have a funny story about that. In our town, a guy came and he opened up a hat shop. Came from California to open up a hat shop. And I thought this looked at this hat and I said, there's got to be some way to clean that, right? We got a man on the moon. There ought to be a way to clean my hat so it doesn't look quite as bad because, you get a little sweaty and then you're blowing in the dust and the dust sticks and you pretty soon. So I stopped into his hat shop and I showed him my hat and I said, "What do you have to clean that hat?" And you know what he said to me? Can you guess?
No.
He said, "Clean that hat? Are you crazy? I have people coming in here paying me hundreds of dollars for hats that look just like that.
Distressed. Uh-huh.
Authentic."
Yeah.
Yeah. He says, "You don't wanna clean that. That's real," you know? It's like, "Well, okay. think I'd make a better impression in a few places if it was a little cleaner. I suppose I need to have a good going to town hat, which I don't have,
I
but,
have to I have to ask you, Brian, have you been watching, like, Norm Macdonald videos? Because your
no, no,
delivery today is reminding me a lot of Norm Macdonald.
that's interesting. Well, you know what's funny is I was doing the show notes and I was in a hurry, so I put it on 1.5 speed, and I thought I sounded like Ben Shapiro, which I
Oh,
thought
yeah.
was kinda curious,
Yeah.
and, so there's an experiment for you folks at home. See what you think.
I think everybody sounds more like Ben Shapiro at 1.5 speed.
I think that's probably the case, yes,
Yeah.
and, but anyway, so the fun thing about these hats is, you might call this a cowboy hat, right? Typically, but for folks that aren't familiar with the West, the significance about this hat, or for those of you listening and not seeing, it's got this big old brim on here, and this brim is because out here in New Mexico, the sun is real intense. And even in the wintertime when it's intense, that's where you have a wool one. And in the summertime, it's even more intense, which is why I have one that has a mesh you can kind of see through there to sort of help the get a little heat dissipation. And but you do need a protection from the sun. And that's why the traditional way out in the southwest and down in Mexico is a hat that they call a sombrero. And I thought that's kind of interesting. Sombrero in Spanish, literally the arrow ending is the ERO ending is like one who does the thing, right?
Person, yeah.
So a
Yeah.
caballo is a horse, so a caballero is a horser. Right? You could say,
Yeah.
right? Well,
Cowboy.
so a sombrero is sombre, a thing that gives a sombre, and sombre is a shadow and or shade. And in English, we have the word somber, which is, I think, the closest relation to the word sombrero. And but we get it in English from the French, and the French, of course, get it from the Latin, the Romans, being a Romance language, not because it's good for writing love poems. Although arguably it may be better than some other languages like German, maybe, but so in Latin, it's made from two words: sub, under, like subdermal or submarine. These are things that go under, uh, and umbra. And umbra is a shade or a shadow. So that's where that whole sombra. And again, it's the idea of being under a shade. But so that got me thinking about hats in general and the general joke that we've made for years that it is all about the hats and what
All
about the
about the hats.
hats?
Yeah.
And uh and so hats are symbolic. Hats show us what roles people have in society. If we think about the chef, or we think about the army guy, or we think about the astronaut, talk about a snappy hat. Um, or we think about the Pope or bishops or cardinals. Uh, you know, um, Even the chess set represents the bishop by his hat, or the king by his hat, or the queen by their hat. the snappiest of hats by definition. So there was this instinct to say, okay, I am the big shot. I get the snappiest hat, right?
Seems
And
fair.
reminds me of a great Key and Peele episode or a little vignette, right? The different hats. It's great. And but so what's that about? Of course, you have to think about the yarmulke, right? Or kippah in Hebrew,
Yep.
and where it represents. And here's where we start to get into the significance of the head, also. Where it represents a relationship with the creative source of the universe, and respect and fear of God. I think traditionally is it's related, which is an interesting concept I'd love to unfold with the rabbi someday here. Um, but so again, the head, and it makes me think of, when I started having children, and you of course are in the midst of this now. They talk about traditionally that there's a soft spot on the top of the head,
Yeah.
and that the child is, they used to say in the old school, still connected to their guardian angel until the soft spot is at the fontanelle,
Yes.
until that actually becomes solid,
Yeah.
right? So there is something interesting there. And this of course relates to, if we look at the Kundalini experience, this idea that energy starts moving in the kund, which is at the base of the spine, and that energy moves up the spine, and the place in Chinese medicine, they call this the meeting of 1,000 points. This acupuncture point that's right on the top here, and this is also the place of the Ajna chakra. I think the highest chakra in the body, and in the Kundalini experience, that's where we literally connect to heaven. So so then we look at the people with the different hats, and now we could say, well, in some of these traditions, that hat starts to imply certain relationships with heaven somehow. Now, see, my dogs, they didn't get any of that. But it's my fault. It's my
Yeah, you
fault.
didn't explain it well enough.
I didn't explain it well enough to them. But so it's interesting because there used to always be this idea, then it gets connected, for example, with signs of respect. With the yarmulke, wearing the hat is the sign of respect, but in many places, it's actually, the removing of the hat that shows respect. But again, there's some significance with the head. And so, anyway, so those were the kinds of musings that came from the dogs having their way with my hat. What's going on with that?
Yeah. Yeah, I remember a friend of mine. We were probably about 9 or 10 years old, and we were on the school bus coming back from a field trip, and his kippah flew out the window of the school bus. It was a nice day, so the windows were open, and he put his baseball glove on his head for the remainder of the day, because it was that important to. Um, I don't know if for him it was keep the tradition or follow the rules or what. Um,
Uh-huh, uh-huh. At that
um,
age, right,
at that age, yeah.
right, right.
Um, yeah, I guess it's funny. I have kind of a ambivalent relationship with hats because I don't wear them nearly as much as I intend to,
Oh,
and I wonder
interesting,
if that's curious. Um,
interesting.
so it's nothing in Philly like it is in New Mexico in terms of sun intensity, but I don't use sunscreen, and a shade hat would be useful,
Yeah, I
and
don't
I don't
either.
have one.
Uh-huh.
It's in New Mexico, so I'm gonna have to go out and find one because um, it makes a world of difference to have one on, and I don't know why I neglect that. Maybe there's that maybe that goes into the self-care category in general. I don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe it's
yeah,
one of
maybe.
the last check boxes to get checked off. I eat now. I exercise, sleep. I've got like some basic self-care worked out. So maybe
Yep.
getting the hat deal organized is the next step.
Right. Well, I've got a few because they are dependent on environmental circumstances, and it really is a part in my environment. It's in the shelter category maybe more than clothing. But it's interesting, and then I think the other thing about this is maybe that I didn't explicate yet this idea of the head in relation to the kund and the idea there's something that goes on, I have deduced from yogas and Taoist Qigongs and things. There's a significance to humans having a vertical axis. And, none of the four-leggeds, I mean, maybe with giraffes, you could stretch it. I don't know that they act particularly.
Kangaroos?
Maybe. But so this idea that by verticalizing ourselves, we created a greater polarity. For example, if you look at the differences between standing meditations and sitting meditations, there's this idea that the potential to generate energy is greater in standing meditations for a couple reasons. But uh, one of them has to do with stretching the poles farther apart, and that creates a bigger differential. And that the Kundalini experience basically has to do with this arcing. That's an energetic arcing, and if that to relate, what do I mean by an energetic arcing? It's involuntary. Uh, look at Look at laughing really hard when you can't stop it. Look at sneezing repeatedly. Look at orgasming. Look at vomiting. And you will see that there is a movement between the top pole and the bottom pole. Right? I imitate a sneeze there. I'm not going to imitate any of the other ones, um, but you get the idea that there is a movement in the tube, the human tube, if you will, in relationship to the positive and the negative, and it shows up as that arcing, right? Now, in Reichian therapy, they put somebody on a massage table, and they have them doing a particular breathing that sort of will build up chi pressure, organ pressure, however you will, within the body, and then uh, their body work has to do with basically attacking armored muscle groups so that energy can move through it. And they conclude that their job is done when the body will show what they call the orgasm reflex. And the orgasm reflex is not an orgasm, but it is a little electric pip in the circuit that is the same in sobbing, laughing, vomiting, sneezing, orgasming, all of those firing of a little arc, right? Now, if you notice, if we go stay with the electrical paradigm, we get two conductors and we put charge, and there's a certain distance between those conductors that'll be the gap, and this is like how your car works, and with that spark jumping across in the spark plug is a little piece of electricity, a little zapitude of electricity jumps across that gap. Well, the farther that gap gets, the bigger the electricity has to build up on one side and then jump across. This is the before the sneeze, right? Or if you notice in the orgasm that there is it isn't something that just comes, right? No pun intended.
Huh.
there's a building up of potential, and then it arcs. Or one Taoist teacher, he said that the way he described it, he said, what you're basically doing is you're building this energetic structure and then crashing it. Right. Well, what's really happening, that energetic structure that's getting built is the stacking up of energy on one side of the pole, on one pole of the dual pole system. And then when that potential is reached, it's great enough to arc across the gap, then the release happens. It's like a capacitor releasing, right? And so in those terms, the head is the plus side, or the heaven related side in the three in harmony model of Taoism. And the kund, or the base, or the feet in the larger model, uh, become the ground, or the matter, or the negative that's energized by the arcing of the right
Is there a
all the
yin and yang dichotomy there?
yeah,
Plus is yang, minus is yin.
heaven and earth, yin and yang, yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then it turns into rain falling from the sky to make the crops grow, with with all the other up and down polarities, the arcing of lightning, the atmospheric great versions of these yin and yang polarities arcing, right? Which is
Kilauea.
Yeah, right, which is going off big time today as we're recording this. And the sun, which is going off big time. I guess we're having some sunspots that are ripe for coronal mass ejections, that will be swinging towards us. If you're listening to this, then civilization made it. If the coronal mass ejection takes us out, then you're not listening to this. Then just completely disregard what I'm saying.
It's not about the hats.
Instead, it's not about that. It's not about anything anymore.
Turns out, not about the hats.
It's not about that. But but yeah, there's an interesting thing that goes on there, and the way that this is connected to this idea that I think Gurdjieff mentions, when he refers to humans as three centered beings. And when we think of us, it's curious that for some reasons we think of our isness, that das Ich, the I, the witness, that we think of it sort of as is stuck behind our eyes somewhere. But when we say, "What about me?" we point to our hearts. And and then the procreative forces come out of that even lower center, maybe, or in that emotional center of the belly, right? Which is interesting. And then with that polarity, the energies of the five elements play within that, in the human energetic system, which is fascinating. But so all of this is somehow related to the mystery of the head, and therefore the hat. Um,
Yeah. I wonder if you might say more about standing meditation as opposed to sitting meditation, because I think a lot of people just think of meditation as sitting on the ground, and they might not know that that Tai Chi and Kung Fu have significant meditative practices that involve standing, that you know uh, I assume predate Buddhism. Um,
I think they're pretty old. I think that they may even relate to hunting gathering times, and the waiting for prey in ambush, where one has to be perfectly motionless for quite a long period of time. Um, and And then maybe, what's the other thing that's likely to be the case when you're hunting? Uh, you're likely to be hungry. And you're also likely to be pretty tired, because it's not like running out to the 7-Eleven. So you could have been at this, especially when you think of, well, it's all there in the name when we talk about humans and how humans hunt. We're persistence hunters, right? Once we got on the trail of something, you just run it down and you can sweat and it can't sweat. So there's a big clue there. You're designed to sweat,
Mm.
right? You've been doing it a long time. If your ancestors
Not
got your
only
butt this
designed
far,
to, but it's your competitive advantage. That's your differentiator.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I guess it's too top down to say you're designed for it. Your meatware is designed for it.
I didn't have a problem with that. I just think it's
Uh-huh,
not just that we're designed for it.
uh-huh.
It's that that's the thing that enables hunting.
And intelligence, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, the ability to sweat is I mean,
uh-huh.
intelligence helps. It's a team sport as I understand it, even with the sweating.
Right, right.
But um
And maybe I mean intelligence in the way that a dog's nose gives him an intelligence, uh, as in taking in information and processing it to get your result. Yeah, so it would
yeah.
be kind of a broad definition there, but yeah, something going on, and what's likely when you're tired and you're hungry and maybe a little desperate and you can't move, you're stuck there waiting for the opportunity. I would make a strong argument you're going to enter an altered state, and that maybe that was the first way in. Maybe that's the first doorway to shamanism. Is this sort of trance state through pushing the biophysical envelope that then maybe ultimately becomes the tradition of fasting and fasting for a vision, which of course was a Native American idea, um, as well as using plant helpers for that. Um, but so with these different meditations, and I think there's a lot of things that are available now. There are these. The standing meditations, they're referred to as zhang zhuang, which is standing like a post that's pounded into the ground. And, the way that I usually describe the things that you're trying to do is rather than just get in and drive the car, you want your initial stage is to take off the emergency brake, which sounds easier than it is. So, in order to do that, we're talking about dialing down chronic muscular holding, which has to do with allowing the meat to rest on the structure of the bones. Well, if the bones aren't in exactly the right alignment, you can't do that because you'll fall over. So you have to kind of find the right shape that will allow a certain amount of deep relaxation. Now, what all the Reiki therapy stuff points out is that telling your mind to relax deeply is only worth so much. And if mind could just relax, you could just say, well, just relax. We wouldn't need any method, right? Don't worry, be happy. It's so easy. And so it turns out that with the model of Reiki therapy says that this contraction, and I don't know if we gone over this in prior episodes, this idea that if you look at an amoeba under a microscope and
Right.
you jab him and he contracts and then he re-expands, and then if you jab him past a certain threshold, when he expands, he won't completely expand again. There is some tension that's held there. Well, we're all sort of subject to that, and that can put a distinct shape into the body because the body is kind of like a mobile, right? You have these stiff pieces that are connected in a loose way. And then you have the meatware kind of hung on that. So that means that it doesn't mean just that you can move your body all sorts of different ways. It also means that you can sort of wear your body into shapes that can become chronic, that can be less optimal for functioning. And that's where a host of different body therapies come in. And interestingly, in those, like for in the standing, one of the things we say in Tai Chi Chuan is that we have Ding Jing Dong Jing, which is this leading the energy up through the top of the head as well as sinking it down. And you have a kind of attraction going on there. And we say lead Jing Shen to the top, right? And Jing Shen is a little tricky to translate. Uh, the way that I try to describe it to people is it's leading is sort of an energy that it's hard to point to. But if you look at your cat's lying there, and then it sees a mouse across the room. You will see it immediately bring Jingshen to the top because he uses his face to do all of his serious work, right? The paws are just sort of to bring it to the mouth. So his head is literally where his energy is moving, and he's got a horizontal spine so that energy to move towards the prey lengthens out his spine, right? Like an arrow towards where he's going. And so he doesn't lead Jingshen to the top, he leads it to the point of the arrow that's going to the prey. Well, when humans went vertical, we start paying attention to stuff that's out there on the horizontal plane. And we lose that primacy of leading energy to the top. Okay. But if you think about the images that leap to mind for me about this are Yul Brynner in The King and I and Mikhail Baryshnikov in White Knights, where there's a natural leading of energy to the top of the spine, and it generates the feeling of regality, right? The king is the one who really leads energy to the top, right? This connects all the way to Peterson's lobsters, right? Where he talks about the most dominant lobster has the most serotonin and he's got the biggest, most spread out. When two peacocks face off to see who's going to get the female, they're just putting their feathers out to be pretty. They're demonstrating who's got the most chi, who's got and they're just quivering with energy to show who's the baddest ass, right? So, so there's this idea that when we're completely energized, we naturally lead energy to the top, right? And it's interesting that that's the direction that we associate with creator energy or heaven or yeah. So, and all this is kind of like all was hidden under the hat, so to speak. Right? And so, so yeah, it's interesting. Directionality and the physiological aspects of that also. You know, you shout at somebody right away, they they start to turtle up, which is, you know, this shortening and lengthening and
So with a sitting meditation, do you think it's impossible or just difficult to create the structure on which the muscles can relax?
I think it's different. I
Okay.
think you're after different things. I think that sitting, when it's done right, you can do for much longer periods of time.
Huh.
And so, uh, that there are two different directions. And you could, I guess you could think of them as inner and outer, that I can develop my energies to meet the world. That's martial arts. Or I can develop my energy to travel in the inner world, and that's uh, energy directed in a different way. Um, so, but more energy helps both. And I think it's a mistake in the Western world that yes, we have that phase where we have to relax, where we have to take the emergency brakes off because we have energy moving against energy. And we need both of those energies united, moving in the same direction. But it's a mistake to take quietude and that neutralizing thing so that your sphere stays right, to turn that into a type of mushiness or a type of weakness. You know, this is what generates it. When people misunderstand Tai Chi, they will do it and they'll end up with what we call tofu Tai Chi, which means it's not steel wrapped in silk anymore. Now it's just a pile of silk, tofu wrapped in silk. It's really guess you know, it's that polarity, that yin and yang interaction that gives it that quality. So what I think is that most people need to do is they need to first take the emergency brakes off so that you're not running the gas and the brakes at the same time, because that's not a sustainable pattern. And
And that looks
then,
like standing and working on structure so that the muscles
yeah,
can relax.
that's how we do it. I don't know that that's the only way, but then the idea is you want to bit once you're sure that you're not driving the pump into a closed valve, right? Or a clogged valve, because then some negative things can happen, as one would imagine, right? But once you know the pipes are clean, so to speak, then you can safely look at bringing up the energy levels. If you try to bring up the energy levels and you've got serious blockages, which almost everybody does, you're just trying to ram energy into those blockages, and sometimes real problems can result from that. So that's the cautionary tale, and why you need to have a teacher eyes on is the only way that we want to do that. Not because I can't tell you what to do, but because I can't see that you're interpreting it correctly and that you're doing it in a balanced way and that you don't have a contraindicated condition, which might be one out of 1,000, but that's a lot of people when you spread it out, right? So but then once you've taken, and that's what Reiki and therapy try to do in a Western way. They're trying to see the chi move through the system and look at what the blockages are. And the traditional way, you're doing it with the character analysis and the sort of the verbal part. Ida Rolf of Rolfing studied with Reich, and she went and sort of separated that out and just did the body work from there, with this idea that, well, if the meatware gets put in the right place, then that'll urge the mentality to go, in the right place. I mean, I think you probably need to work a little bit in both directions. So you don't have a lot of time, right? You don't you don't have a lot of time. I think you need to push the boat in with both oars, right? But but so, those things, those blockages, what Wright called armoring, that prevent energy from moving at the optimal levels, those are usually related to some sort of an impact from the outside that was not energetically recovered, not entirely chingon again, as we say in my country. And uh, so there is this idea that you kind of need to do a work to repair that, and as that happens, there might be associated mental things that sort of release to your awareness once that energetic thing has sort of been moved off. And so then it's like, if we have these 8 different circuits, and every one of these, little by little, it starts to move more energy. At some point we get to where the energy can move, and then that arc can happen. And then the system has a certain integrity to itself, and it has a resilience to the attacks from the outside now, both psychically, psychologically, and physically, as one would hope, and that's why these have been, cheek and jowl with the martial traditions for a long time. And uh, but so yeah, now see, in here somewhere is gonna be why Buddhist monks are shaving their heads too, right?
Yeah, or why uh, Native Americans might keep their hair long.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting that the Native American tradition, I'm sure there's versions in Africa, where bird feathers are used to adorn the head. I mean, I suppose you might see bird feathers in other body parts. But again, this idea of the caduceus, right? Where the two snakes, the Ida and the Pinglala, they hit the eye, and the eye opens, and the eye has wings. So if the spine is the caduceus in the center and the two nervous systems are the snakes coiling their way up, then that eye opening and the flight, the association of the head with flight, uh, maybe would connect to wearing a bird feathers on your head, which is both North and South American tradition.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, yeah, interesting.
Got it. And so after somebody is comfortable with standing meditation, then sit. Like I wonder about the hip alignment, and like I've been thinking about hips lately because it's pretty easy to get certain type of hip movements
In
um,
sitting, you mean, or
frequently.
standing? In sitting or standing?
In life, it's pretty easy to get
Oh,
certain kinds of
okay.
movements, but to get other kinds of movements is not as easy, like lateral hip movement. You gotta, like, intentionally move laterally to do that, but, the horseback stance, gets into that,
Mhm.
or so
Well,
so and even to some extent, just the regular standing meditation, Santi does also in
yeah,
Shingi. Like you're
yeah.
getting lateral hip movement that you don't normally get just walking around. Um,
Well, and it isn't just about, I mean, the hip movement is related to this idea of the gua. And the gua is the inguinal cut where the pelvis meets the leg. And uh, where you can kind of catch your hand in there. And in Chinese medicine, there is this idea of they have certain areas that they might refer to or might get understood as organs, but if because they are functional entities. But if you dissect, you won't find any organ per se there, or you might just find a gathering of lymph glands, more
or
likely than
nerves,
not,
or yeah,
or nerves or something. But so part of the movement in martial arts has to do with the opening and closing of the sides of the pelvis and those gua, and that has to do with opening and closing the rest of the body. Um, but on the psychophysiological level, you do see patients that are completely immobile in the pelvis, and sometimes from an early age, and that's usually considered one of the flag posts, informationally for what you're dealing with.
and then sitting, you've got your hips sort of cranked open for really extended periods of time, but not a lot of movement, not necessarily a lot of other positions.
Yeah, and
So
there's
I
a few
imagine
different
that's got
ways
the
to sit.
gua open, right?
Mhm.
What from a maybe a Tai Chi standpoint or a five element standpoint, what's the effect of holding the gua open like that instead of running it back and forth like a bellows?
Well, you can move energy with mind, you can move energy with physical movement. So, moving energy directly with mind is more advanced. And so if you're moving it, if you've got a natural, or you've developed a certain base level of energy, then maybe your movement with the mind is more easily achieved. But so maybe at a more beginning stage, you might need more pumping to get things to open up to build some energy. But then once the energy is built enough that it becomes palpable, then you can move it with mind, right? And I think I've demonstrated this, the difference between moving chi with breath and moving chi with mind. And it's usually one of the demos that I do when we're trying to talk about, well, what is chi? And so there's this idea within internal martial arts and within Chinese medicine that I guess it's related to elemental theory, and I might have mentioned this before. This idea, for example, that fingernails are tendon on the surface, and tongue is muscle that's right on the surface, and eyeballs are organ that's right on the surface. Well, if you look at those classics, they relate chi to the hair. And a lot of times people don't know how to understand that. And they think, well, if you have good, nice long hair, that means you have good chi. It's like, nah, that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about the chi on the arm or on hair, like when you get cold and you get goosebumps. That's the chi showing up at the surface to fight off the cold. And that's where the chi is showing up on the hair. And if you practice, you get to where you can do certain movements of energy and make the hair stand up, right? And so so to move energy directly with mind at in the beginning is nearly impossible because if your energy is organized against itself into some degrees, that sort of keeps the energy flows down and it makes it harder to feel because there's sort of less moving in obvious ways. So that's where that taking the emergency brake phase comes in, and that's the appropriate place for relaxation so that then when you bring the energy up, you're not pumping it into knots and folds. And you're actually be able to circulate it and move it, and then everything stays good. You know. So once there's plenty of it, and you're used to it moving, and you know what the feeling of moving it is like, then you just move it. Just directly. But until it's there and until you practice moving it, until you feel it, you go, "Oh, that. Oh, okay, that." Then you're kind of unconscious about it. And I think I mentioned before when I first started Bhagwan, I was holding a certain posture when I was walking. So I had the machine going, I had the pump going, but I was just holding a posture and my intent wasn't directing the energy. And so I was unconsciously directing it through 3 fingers and not through 2 fingers, to the other 2 fingers, and it was real cold outside, and my 3 fingers heated up and the other 2 stayed cold, you know? So that's because I didn't have the ability. I wasn't discriminating internally. Well, if you don't have the sensation, you don't know what to discriminate, you don't have a handle, right? So you do some things that are kind of like maybe coarse in the beginning, but they generate something for you to oh that so and so without an internal sensation to attach to, you don't know what you're after inside. And then that's why a lot of teachers they don't have it themselves, and so it's very hard to direct somebody to that because it's easy. Somebody could listen to what I'm saying and they could start telling people that, but that doesn't mean that they're distinguishing in the practice that that's what's happening. And so that's why there's some incrementalities there that are best followed, and some problems avoided that way too, in
Mhm.
general. um,
Cool. Well, that's an interesting place to end up. Starting with it's all about the hats. It makes sense, and we should probably talk more in future episodes about. This is like a really unique area of expertise that you have. The kind of body energetics, um, and and
it's a little ahead of the curve. It's not making sense to a lot of people just yet.
yeah,
And because a lot of people now are as far as they're not owning the turf, right? It's like something goes wrong, we're going to go talk to a professional, and that professional is going to tell us something about something we live with every day. And yeah, they will. They can measure your blood sugar and they can read your pulse rate and they can do tests on your blood and your urine and they can tell you all sorts of stuff. It's interesting there. That type of knowledge is that left brain. We can pick out this, we can pick out that, we can pick out this, and we're going to have a list and we're going to see which ones we pick out, right? Which is different than the right brain approach that I'm out there in the horizon, I'm out there in the landscape. And yeah, I might be looking for berries, but I also know there's grizzly bears out here. And I also know there's rattlesnakes, and I also know there's hostile people towards me, and I also know so I have to have this I have to understand the whole picture, and that's we talked about this before as a sensibility towards coherence, to seeing how everything sticks together, right? If you see how everything sticks together, when the bird stops singing, you'll know that something made him stop, right? Or that kind of thing. And so we're not as advanced in understanding the coherences of things. So we come at it from one side and we pull out these different elements that we can pull out with that left brain, pick it out of the background skill. We don't always understand how all those things put together build the wholes.
Yeah,
And so my argument would be that you have access to your own holistic circuits in a way that someone on the outside, even though they're running this objective thing, that system isn't great always on understanding the whole coherent pieces.
sure.
Yeah. And so this is a way that you first person understand, start to understand how things work. And as you get older, your body will start feeding you signals that you will be able hopefully to decode, even like it does when you're practicing and your shoulder doesn't quite feel right. You say, well, I have to, and then after a while it opens up and then you're in a different condition. So there's it's a feedback loop, right? Maybe it's an internal hermeneutical, right? Some phenomenological hermeneutical circle.
Gotta be. Yeah.
Yeah.
We were talking to the pediatrician recently. Sonny's regular checkup, and he seems to get gas a lot. And the pediatrician suggested a point on the toes, right underneath the toes,
Okay.
to press on. And I was like, oh my god, I don't know what point that is acupuncture wise, but
Mhm.
clearly this is one of those things where acupuncture is being used um, as a in the ultimately fragmented way, and stripping all the coherence out of it, like
Right, right,
no
right.
pulses, no looking at the tongue, no nothing, but use this point for that thing. That's not how acupuncture works.
We call that
Yeah, yeah.
cookbook medicine. Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
and like you
and
said,
that they've been trained a thinking method.
yeah,
And that's what the doctors who ran the school that I taught at, they would talk about think method. And to me, the most fascinating part of it all were classes that they call clinical review, where here's a patient, here's what they presented with. Here's what I did to get more information. Here's what I got. Here's the conclusion that I made. Here's the treatment that I took from that conclusion, that diagnosis. So so the entire thinking method from the diagnosis to the treatment, and then the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. And in the Orient, they have competitions with doctors and patients. And one of my teachers, he would talk about, oh, that would have been a good patient for the competition, you know, because literally, the one that I'm thinking of, the guy came in and his hands were so painful he couldn't shift his truck, and within 45 seconds, part of the hand moved, and a little bit longer than the rest of the hand moved, and so it was one of those and into the holster kind of moments,
yeah.
and but so this is all kind of owner's manual information,
Well,
and
some people
and
have more of the owner's manual
well,
than
it's
others.
out
So
there
I,
now.
I think we should come back to it. I think it'd
Yeah,
be,
yeah,
yeah. There's definitely more to mine here.
yeah, yeah. It's the running of the self,
Yeah,
and no, or the stuff that it would be nice if we all were told that to get from Jump
yeah.
Street.
This seems
Yeah,
like useful information.
yeah, yeah. I'd say, and I was thinking, at some point, it would also might be interesting to talk about some of my teachers in particular,
Yeah,
and just the different windows on the big picture that they represented. Um,
cool.
yeah, very cool.
Well, thank you, Brian.
Sounds good. We'll
See
see
you.
everybody next time.